Thank you, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Can I welcome everyone to this reconvened meeting from the 5th of February, where it was agreed the committee would continue to address the Mayor's budget proposals. Introductions will be done later before the item begins. Firstly, housekeeping. A fire practice is not expected, but if the alarm sounds, can all present leave the building as quickly as possible by way of the nearest exit. The designated assembly point is in the public square in front of Cast, beyond the fountain, away from the civic office. If there's anybody with mobility issues, please wait in the refuge area at the top of the stairs, where the emergency evacuation lift is located, and use the intercom situated to the left-hand side of the lift doors to call for assistance. No roll call will be undertaken. Thank you. Would ask that everyone to ensure that your mobile phones are switched to silent mode, please, if you could do that. Thank you. This meeting will be audio visually recorded and will be available to view on the Council's website and YouTube channel. Can I ask all those present to use their microphones to ensure the audio can be captured? Any members of the public entering the Council chamber are accepting that their images will be retained and broadcast by the Council. If any members of the public or press are intending to record or film any part of today's meeting, please ensure that this does not disturb the conduct of the meeting. We'll now move on to the agenda items. Item 1, apologies for absence, have been received from Councillor Gemma Cobby, Councillor Rebecca Booth, Councillor Steve Cox, Councillor John Reid, and co-optee Antoinette Drinkle. Are there any other apologies of absence? Thank you, Caroline. Item 2, to consider the extent, if any, to which the public and press are to be excluded from the meeting. There are no issues on the agenda. Item 3, declarations of interest, if any. If you have an interest, please declare this and a form will need to be completed following the meeting. Please contact Caroline Martin, who can assist you with the process. Before we move on to item 4, I just want to read out a short statement. Just to join on last week to this week. Colleagues, officers and members of the public, I would like to open today's budget scrutiny session by setting out the committee's purpose and the approach we will be taking. The Council is entering the 26-27 financial year facing significant and well-documented pressures. The Mayor's published budget proposal highlights substantial challenges around rising demand in adults and children's social care, inflationary pressures and the need to maintain investment in key services and infrastructure across the city. At the same time, the wider revenue and capital budget framework reinforces the importance of financial resilience, responsible borrowing and the effective prioritisation of resources. Our role as the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee is not to support or oppose the proposed budget. Our role is to ensure that it is transparent, evidence-based, robustly risk-assessed and fully understood before it is presented to full Council. We will therefore be focusing today on 4 key areas of assurance. First, the assumptions underpinning the budget, including demand forecasts, inflation estimates and the rationale for the proposed 4.99% council tax increase. Second, the management of financial risk, particularly in relation to reserves, the dedicated schools grant deficit and treasury exposure arising from borrowing and interest rate volatility. Third, the deliverability of the savings programme, ensuring that any identified savings are realistic, measurable and supported by clear plans. Fourth, the affordability and prioritisation of the capital programme, given its scale, its importance to residents and its long-term financial implications. I would like to take this moment to reiterate for the record that although I was previously Deputy Leader of the Reform Group, I resigned that position specifically to avoid any conflict of interest with my scrutiny responsibilities as Chair of this committee. I have had no involvement whatsoever in the development or drafting of my former group's budget proposals. My role here today is impartial and solely to ensure that scrutiny is rigorous, fair and in the public interest. I ask members to frame their questions in a way that is constructive and focused on gaining clarity, strengthening assurance and ensuring transparency for residents. Officers are here to assist the committee in that task, and I thank them in advance for their openness. With that, we will now proceed to the first item of business, beginning with an overview from officers before moving into committee questioning. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I don't really have anything more to say other than what I did last week, which was effectively, there's multi-parts that you're examining. They all come together in terms of that setting of the budget. So they need to be set in context. So as you were describing just then, you need to look at the capital budget, the treasury management strategy that sets out how we intend to borrow, and the HRA in terms of, because they're all interdependent. You can't see one without the other because they all then come together in that revenue budget proposal, which actually, as you've said in your opening remarks, sets out some of those really key challenges that we have about adults and children's services, as well as waste and some other areas, and why how challenging the financial position is, and that's in part why that results in that manifestation of the council tax being set at 4.99%. So just to re-centre us in terms of all those parts, and that's how it comes to with that final. So when people talk about the revenue budget, it isn't one thing. It's a plethora of information that comes together, and it's important to understand those other elements in order to inform that outcome. Thank you.
Favour, anything you'd like to add? Since we adjourned on last week, is there anything that you need to highlight before we go on to questions that's of note?
I suppose the only thing really to highlight is we've had communication today that the final settlement is due today. You may have seen the information in the press in terms of further money that is proposed to be allocated as part of the overall settlement. So when I checked before coming in, it hadn't been published yet, but we are expecting it at some point today. But as I said last time, that doesn't materially impact on the proposals that we're discussing.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Okay, well, as normally, I'll ask for questions from OSMC first, then other members who may have a question. Can I ask, if you do have a supplementary question, anyone, can you just please indicate to me that you do so? And then obviously, if time allows, we'll get that supplementary asked as well. So thank you. So question one basically is over to you, Councillor Kidd.
Thank you, Chair. We've had access to the Mayor's draft proposals for longer than we have had access to her final budget. Is there any significant difference that we ought to know about? Thank you.
Yeah, no, there's no significant differences between the initial summary information provided and then the detail. I suppose it's more in the information provided, it was the overall level of savings, and then it's the individual lines by line. But no, there's no significant difference between the initial information provided, what was in the final, the cabinet papers.
Thank you. Question two then. It's the question I asked last week. It's the same question. Obviously, with regard to rent policy, the council has the ability or the flexibility to go above 5% or above the formula for rent increases, and yet we have obviously one of the lowest rents in the country. I think number 13. Same question as last time. Can you just explain why those seem to be opposing things?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think as I kind of start to explain last time, it's not the overall rent, it's more specific circumstances. So just to outline the rent flexibility level, the government recognises that registered providers should have some discretion over the rent set for individual properties, not for all properties. So this can take into account local factors, concerns, and has to be done in consultation with the tenants as well. So that specific tenants in terms of that property have to be consulted on this rent flexibility. So the policy allows for certain flexibility to set it above 5% above the formula rent. It's 10% for supported housing, but that's not relevant. So if applying this flexibility, providers should ensure that there is a clear rationale and it takes into account local circumstances and affordability. What we find is in our experience, it applies for kind of new build where there's a higher spec or where there's been an acquisition at a higher cost than sort of other properties. So it requires additional refurbishment or adaptation costs. And as I say, there has to be a specific rationale in relation to that individual property, and the tenants, the prospective tenants, have to be consulted before you can apply the 5%. So it's very specific circumstances in terms of that policy, rather than overall, as we talked about last time, that's based on CPI plus 1%. Hopefully that clarifies it.
It does, thank you. Thank you, Faye. Move on to the next question. What alternative council tax scenarios, for example 3.99% or 2.99%, were modelled during budget preparation? And can you provide the committee with the corresponding impact on required savings, service reductions or risk exposure under each scenario? If such modelling was not carried out, why not? Thank you.
Thank you. So last week we talked quite extensively about the robust budget setting process that we go through. So part of the first things we need to do is understand what the baseline is, what's the requirements, what's the pressures, what's the needs, what's that baseline position. We work really closely with this. I'm looking to my colleagues that were here last week in terms of what those assumptions are, and then that kind of is the start of building together our MTFS. Once we've kind of produced all the inflation assumptions that we talked about, so we produce all the different assumptions and kind of feed that into our MTFS. At the same time, we're reviewing our income assumptions, so how much are we likely to get from business rates, how much could we get from fees and charges, building up this complex picture in terms of what the MTFS is. I talk about our MTFS is calculated on a spreadsheet, so there are different ways that you can model different assumptions on that spreadsheet. So at various points, we're kind of, considering different assumptions. What's the impact? What's the impact if inflation, goes up higher? What's the impact if pressures are more, or what's that position? So at various points, we kind of take a kind of a position statement in terms of where are we at in terms of our MTFS? What's it currently looking like? And generally, when we produce the first one, pressures outweigh income always in terms of, so then it's kind of going back to, well, what do we need to do? Can we reduce pressures in this area? Can we deliver more savings, or what savings can we deliver? And we go round this kind of circle really, or loop really, in terms of, so this is the initial position, right, it doesn't balance, what more do we need to do? Go back and have further conversations about, can we deliver more in this area? Can we reduce kind of budget pressures? That spreadsheet allows you to kind of put in different assumptions for council tax. We start with, I suppose, the government expectation. So we started with the 4.99 because that's what's built into our funding formula. But at various points, we can model different percentages. We know that if we reduce it by 1%, that means we've got 1.5 million less funding. So conversely, we either need to look at, can we reduce pressures by 1.5 million? Can we deliver more savings by 1.5 million? The 2% equates to 3 million, so same process really in terms of could we deliver more? Last week we talked quite a lot about the volatility of the budget, the volatility of the pressures, and that challenge in terms of managing those pressures as well. So within this, there is that kind of undercurrent really in terms of those assumptions as well. We also talked about the recovery grant as well, which is 9.9 million for 3 years built in, but that at the end of those 3 years, that's not kind of assured as part of our funding. So presenting that cliff edge. So all these factors are kind of, incorporated in terms of what that modelling looks like. But yes, we do kind of look at what the impact is of different council tax assumptions and what that would mean in terms of the pressures and the savings that are in there, and what other kind of options.
I don't want this to sound like a strange question, but for the 315,000 people sat out there, some of them may watch this, may look at the minutes of the meeting. How would you describe in more simple terms why we've had to go for 4.99%, please, for people out there wondering why we've gone for the maximum again? In simple terms that the people would understand it out there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is a difficult one. It is really difficult in terms of, because we don't live in a vacuum. We know in terms of the impact on the citizens of Doncaster. So it isn't something taken lightly. But I have to kind of assure in terms of that financial sustainability, and I've got to assure that we've got sufficient income moving forward to meet our pressures. And currently, those budget pressures are increasing. You know, we've talked about the adult social care pressures. We've talked about the children's social care pressures. That we've been notified in terms of our government funding. Like, so we'll get the final settlement today, but that's not sufficient to meet those pressures. And so we rely on council tax, which is a form of ongoing income in terms of that future sustainability. I think we talked last time about it shouldn't be funding adult social care pressures. You know, we talked about that, but that's the mechanism that is available to us. So in order for me to kind of sign off in terms of the robustness of the proposals, unfortunately, it's a...
Although I just said at my opening remarks that you need to look at everything in context, but in terms of honing in on in response to your question, Appendix B of the revenue report sets out the detailed budget pressures. They tally £21 million over the 3 years, £21 million. So whilst council tax provides a revenue stream, and Faye, I'll just exemplify what 1,000 homes would bring, new homes, that increase that from our council tax base is wholly inadequate to meet those needs, which is in part why we bear down on pressures, we look for efficiencies constantly, and while we maximise income wherever we can. The expectation this year is that we largely take the full increase, because if we don't, then the government will probably look dimly on us in terms of if we then complain about not having sufficient resources in due course. The revenue settlement, the monies that government do give us, is largely predicated on the basis that we maximise the council tax increase that's available to us.
Sorry, yeah. Also, in terms of when considering it, we have retained our local council tax support scheme. That hasn't been modified over the years, so that continues to provide for those that kind of meet the criteria and support. And there's 28 million incorporated that provides, kind of relief. Yeah, don't need to pay the council tax because of that criteria.
Thank you for that. Moving to the next question, Councillor Kidd.
Excuse me. Given that uncommitted general fund reserves stand at £12.7 million, while quantified risks total £12 million, what level of assurance can you give OSMC that reserve levels are adequate? How was the risk reserve balance stress tested, and what would trigger a reserve strategy review? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kidd. Probably firstly, I need to recognise that there's a contingency budget within the funding as well of 6 million in terms of, so that would be the first call. So if there's overspends or, there's something that happens in year, thinking about the demand pressures that we talked about last time, that would be the first the first place we'd go to really in terms of funding those pressures. And that's ongoing as well. So that's better in some ways because that provides ongoing budget in terms of, if we talked about pay inflation, we've built in 3.5%, that could be more. So if that is more, then that would provide ongoing funding to meet that ongoing pressure. As we know, reserves are one-off, so they can only kind of provide for that any kind of pressures on a one-off basis, but it gives you time, and that's the key thing. So firstly, there's the contingency of 6 million. The next place which we would look at is earmarked reserves. So again, if we've utilised all the contingency, if you think about the conversations we've been having as part of 25-26, that's what we've kind of done in 25-26 really. We've exhausted the in-year contingency we had on pay award and service pressures. So then the next place we've kind of then had to reviewed is earmarked reserves. So is there any earmarked reserves that are set aside that we could unearmark? So where we were proposing, so some of this is about us planning ahead and thinking about what feasibility we need for capital schemes and things like that, but unfortunately with overspending, so we're going to have to kind of unearmark that money for that specific purpose and use it to balance the 25-26 position. The last place we would go is uncommitted reserves, and that's because mainly they're held for unforeseen events. So they should be, ideally, in terms of if something's hit us, we hadn't forecast. However, what we have done as a kind of backstop is been through the risk assessment of reserves, as you say, and highlighted that, well, based on 25-26, 5 million overspend, so we've allocated that in for in terms of the overspend and budgetary. But again, it's only one-off, whereas a lot of those pressures are ongoing, so it's providing the time. So to be prudent, we've done that analysis against the uncommitted reserves, but that would be a backstop really in terms of that position. I suppose also to say the budget is at a point in time. You know, we've talked about this continuous cycle really in terms of 25-26 monitoring and 26-27, and it continues because at the moment we're doing Q3 monitoring, so we need to assess how that impacts on those 26-27 assumptions as well. So it's that constant close monitoring and updating.
Probably just worth, again, referencing the context. Our external auditors have considered this and they're probably saying the same thing to lots of authorities, given the risks that are prevalent and the challenges ahead, then you need to shore up your reserves. So, it's also saying we need to assess the quantum in that context as well. So just like everybody should be saving for a rainy day, so do we.
Sorry, it was trigger. So what we have put in the report is as well that we will be doing a review of our reserve strategy as part of the outturn, because I think we talked last time about the dedicated schools grant is a significant risk in terms of that overall consideration of the impact and what we may require moving forward. So today we're expecting further information on the government proposals for the dedicated schools grant deficit, and then we'll be considering and doing more analysis and more assessment really in terms of that to feed into the outturn report.
Can you give us an overview what the reserve strategy is looking like over the MTF's period, the 3-year period? Because I know we're able to more accurate forecasts because we get figures for those 3 years now. What's the actual landscape looking for the next 3 years regarding the reserves?
If that's okay. I think it's a good question, but it's hard to answer because the biggest risk that we're facing is around DSG. So depending on the landscape, depending on the white paper in terms of how that's going to be funded. So thus far, all we've got is some helpful but not exacting commentary in relation to how that might be managed. So the reference is about it being the overspend being held at DFE level. By the end of our period, it's £118 million overspend. It's inconceivable how that would be dealt with. And if you think about Doncaster in the context of, I'm not going to do 3 Ds rather than 3 Bs, which I did in the informal session. You think about the much bigger organisations like Birmingham, I am going to do a B, because Birmingham is enormous. I don't even know what their scale is. So how they in the context that they're operating, which is very challenging, unless we get some real cast iron certainty around the arrangements so that they don't fully detriment the council's financial position, and the ongoing and cumulative deficit, then the reserve strategy needs to be cognisant of the risks that are presenting themselves. So if it's saying, as a, for example, that we need to bear 10% of that, then we've got, and then the reserve strategy is going to be incredibly challenging. The challenge will be that the council would need to cut frontline services, because we could not service that by any. So Faye's described a spectrum of solutions, from something that's looking at non-recurrent funding and whether we could reprioritise it in that context, to utilising reserves that we have that are non-recurrent basis. If we were presented with that risk, none of those would be adequate. So it doesn't sound like a helpful response to your question, but it's where we are, because we don't have clarity about the landscape we're operating in. And I hate to tell you, but most years we don't. There will be, if it's not DSG, it'll be something else we don't know, because this is a big and complex and dynamic organisation. And as a result, we are constantly considering all these matters as part of this as budget formulation. I don't know, this is not an easy job, looking through all these multiple lenses and providing information to decision makers about choices, because that's fundamentally what it comes down to, and risk appetite. So it might be that actually, depending on the landscape, we're fairly secure in our future placement strategy in relation to for educational needs and children's services, that we feel that the risk won't be as great as it might be. But equally, there's another assessment that goes, well, even if we do all those, if we all put those mitigations in place, we'll still be presented with these type of challenges. And it's through those, complex considerations that then that informs how much money do we need as a backstop.
Thank you. The next question actually expands on that question. I didn't mean to go into the next question. Councillor Hollingsworth, are you all right to ask that question, or do you want me to? Are you okay with that? Yeah? Okay.
With the statutory DSG override due to 31st of March 2028, can you present the 3 scenario models: full government, write-off, 50-50 apportionment and full local liability, that would show the revenue impact and the general fund and reserves? If these models have not yet been completed, when will they be available to OSMC?
I can start that off, because obviously it builds on what I was just talking about. Modelling, it's doddle. It's a spreadsheet, a simple spreadsheet at that, with lots of detail behind it, because we've worked with colleagues within children's services about the numbers of people we're supporting and their typical packages, as well as so that detail modelling is there to arrive at what future placement activities are required and the type of setting that they're in order to quantify the future design of the service, because that's first and foremost an important thing, and then also the costs associated with it. Excuse me. Once you have that, in terms of you can model any scenario, and it's not going to be one of those 3, I can guarantee it. But so in terms of quantifying it, it's a doddle. It's what you do about it is the killer question, and we will only know that when we have the white paper, which sets out the relationship between the DFE, the DSG that comes through the local authority, and schools. That's the partnership, and the partnership in terms of schools is equally as complicated, because we have grant maintained schools, we have academies, and we have independent schools. So that landscape that partnership is really complicated, and I suggest it's possibly a matter that the overview and scrutiny panel needs to really get its teeth stuck into. But only once we've got that white paper and we've got the funding. So in terms of arriving at the budget, all we can do is know that that's a risk. But at this point, we have rules that we apply within accountancy. And if you know something and you can quantify it, then do something about it. I'm slightly paraphrasing a rule, but we don't really know what the landscape is, and we can't really quantify it. So that's in part why we talk about it as a strategic risk, and something that, as Faye's describing, that once we've got a bit more information and we've got the outturn, we'll be able to formulate our risk strategy, our reserve strategy. We've briefly talked about this with the external auditor, because they made a recommendation about us shoring up our reserves, and I think they understand that we don't have all the necessary information at this point in time in order to arrive at a hard rule or a hard piece of information at this point in time, but we will in due course.
Thank you. I think it's just to highlight as well, and I'm sure further information will be provided on this, but we've had a peer review, and they've kind of, supported the close working between our finance teams and the managers as well in terms of that, looking at what the sufficiency is, calculating what the impact would be on the dedicated schools grant. And I was going to highlight, as Debbie said, we're having constant discussions with our external auditors as well about the approach.
Thank you. I think, again, it's just the opportunity to let the people out there know why we're thinking. Obviously, I'm sure you are actively looking into different kind of scenarios. You mentioned a 10% liability earlier on, Debbie. Would we survive that? If it was a 10% liability on the DSG come March 2028, would we survive that, actually, if that was the outcome? Just as an example for the people out there. Because what we're saying then is anything worse than that, we're a bit stuck, aren't we?
The start, but Faye would probably come back in from the 151. If it was 10%, we as I say, even 10%. So that was something that the Treasury, I think, a national chat room sort of level, they were debating between DFE and Treasury. We've never seen that actually written down. So a 10% would equate to the 18 million quid. We haven't got 18 million quid, so that would require still really hard management action to arrive at that point. If that was the deal, let's call it, in relation to cumulative deficit, then we would need to look at measures that we would bring to bear in order to arrive at that point. If that was the deal again, and we've got a statutory duty to set a solvent budget, and as a result of that, we'd need to resolve that. So if that was the deal that was the expectations at national level, then we'd all local authorities would need to deal with that.
So that's how fraught it is then. Even 10%'s a stretch for us. Yeah, got you. Thank you for that. Question 4, Councillor Jackson.
Sorry, just to add as well. So if we're thinking about timing, we would have 2 years to kind of be planning, but as Debbie said, that would be a real challenge. What we would probably be looking at is exceptional financial support, where there might be something in terms of kind of, repaying, or I'm trying to get into the space of what might be the options, but that might be something that we would have to consider.
And that's more likely to get more clarity over that the closer we get to March 28, really, aren't we? That's probably what you're saying.
Yeah, just to come back, we'll probably know before that, because effectively I think that's why the government is signalling, because it's not just us about getting his head around it. I think the expectation will be schools will need to, the system needs to evolve, and we need to, there's capital investment that's included in the capital programme about shoring up our alternative placement provision, and that will be within school setting. So their expectation is, you know, the whole system needs to sort of step up to the mark in terms of those new expectations.
Sorry, just to also highlight, included in that 118 million deficit is that in-year deficit, which is increasing. So like I say, in terms of we all need to kind of look at what that happens with that. But we've got 19 million for 25-26, 28 million 26-27, increasing to 33. So it's that in-year as well as the deficit cumulative.
It's fundamental changes we're looking for, isn't it, and everything. And you were right, Debbie, in saying that it's a really good thing for one of the panels to come back to you on and really start. After we've had the white paper and everything like that, then let's see what the landscape looks like then, yeah. Councillor Jackson?
Right, ladies, what detailed stress tests have been undertaken to assess the impact on the revenue budget if the council is required to externalise the current under-borrowing short-term exposure at present or higher Public Works Loan Board rates? Please provide the committee with the trigger conditions and what force refinancing and the mitigation in place.
Thank you. I think, well, we closely manage and closely monitor our treasury management position. I know you've all had really detailed treasury management training from our treasury management manager, because 98% of you have actually kind of undertaken that training, which is really, really positive. I think the stress test is the ongoing analysis of our short-term borrowing and our under-borrowing position, because we do rely on that under-borrowing position to keep our costs down, really, in terms of not borrowing if we don't need to. We do have, I don't know whether it's a good or a safe, you know, in terms of our position. Other local authorities are willing to lend to us, so that is always an option for us and tends to be slightly lower rates than the PWLB. So we do have cross council borrowing lending, really, in terms of to maximise across the sector where there are surplus, where some authorities might have some surplus cash and others require it, then we can there's the ability to kind of almost deal across, really, in terms of, and we are kind of viewed as a safe perspective, i.e. they'll get the money back. What we also do, we work very closely with our South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority as well, in terms of borrowing from SIMCA, so that is also another avenue. And if those would be not available for some reason, then, like I say, we would go to PWLB. What we also have with PWB is we have access to the certainty rates as well. Currently they're comparable, so that's another avenue. As we've talked about, the under-borrowing does rely on our own reserves, our own balances, so we need to monitor those closely. We monitor those quarterly in terms of what those position is. We also work very closely with our Treasury Management Advisors, previously linked, now MUFG, in terms of what their analysis of our balance sheet is, what kind of things that they would kind of look for as well. The trigger conditions would be when our short-term borrowing starts to get close to the allowed parameters. And then we would need to kind of have a look at, well, do we reduce the capital programme? Do we need to seek longer-term borrowing? Or so we're constantly reviewing that, really, with our advisors. So I think it's just that constant review. What we have done is we've factored into the budget what would be required, what is estimated based on the current rates. I think we talked last time that MUFG provides some future estimated rates as well, and we utilise those in the calculation. But we continue to monitor those treasury budgets closely. So we only borrow if we need to in terms of additional borrowing, and we kind of report that really through the quarterly monitoring, where we've highlighted an overspend in 25-26. So we've realigned the budgets for 26-27.
I think fundamentally, this question is about if things went wrong, what would we do? And it's helpful to think in the context. Well, if this was your spend, your budget, what would you do? first thing would be stop spending. So the first thing we would do is look at our capital programme. We'd reassess. You remember it's a 5-year programme, so effectively there's things, and you'll see that as it's coming through the revenue reporting, on a quarterly basis, that we've got things which are already in the pipeline, and we've got things that are at feasibility stage and at development. And if things, let's go back to the scenario where DFE or the Treasury say that we've got to fund that 10%, then one of our measures will be to reassess the capital programme in light of that. So there's a number of tools that we've got at our disposal, not just what Faye's describing in terms of from a refinancing point of view, but also more fundamentally. So that will be a first port of call, actually. What have you started? What can you stop? And just look at reassessing the overall capital programme and therefore really what needs to be spent at what point, because that's the thing that's going to impact on your longer term borrowing.
Last week, I think, is the first time I'd heard of under borrowing. I didn't quite understand that. Are there pros and cons of under borrowing? Can you just explain what that is, please, just in basic terms?
Yeah, so as we've talked about previously, we borrow for our cash flow and for our capital programme. What we do is you could kind of be focused on your capital programme, so borrow for your capital programme. But what we do is, rather than kind of saying, oh yeah, we're going to be purchasing these in the next year, we'll go out and borrow. No, what we do is we kind of look at our cash flow, and if we've got balances that we can utilise so that we don't need to borrow, then we'll utilise those cash balances. So working capital, if we've received any grants, those kind of things. We look at what reserves we've got, we look at what money we hold, rather than going out and borrowing at that point in time. So some of the risk is that if things happen and actually you need to go out and borrow tomorrow or something, a sizable amount, then potentially you could be in a difficult position, because how do you've got to access that borrowing quickly. What are the rates at that point in time? So it might be that at that point in time the rates are higher. So do you really, you might be forced to take a significant amount of borrowing at that point, because you've relied on under borrowing as a way of funding of cash flow in your spend. So there's a risk that when you then need to borrow, it might be at a higher rate. Now, I think I talked about last time that we have got a mix of borrowing, and we've got 67%, something like that, over a longer period. So we have kind of mitigated some of that risk in terms of we're not completely reliant on short-term borrowing. We've got a balanced portfolio, which is how kind of MUFG would kind of talk about it, really, in terms of we have got some longer term borrowing to balance that overall position. So rather than so we're relying on the cash reserves that we've kind of got, rather than going out and borrowing for longer term capital, so not matching.
So Faye's just concentrated on the risks there, because the opportunities are obviously that if you use internal borrowing, then you're not paying for interest. What you're doing is you're losing the ability to get interest off those reserves. So you're trading a mortgage for a savings account. Do you get that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'll take the next question. The budget assumes external grant funding for airport-related borrowing. What is the quantified downside scenario if grant timelines slip or funding is partially withheld? When will OSMC be able to review a full risk and sensitivity analysis for the airport programme, please?
Okay, thank you. So remember, we looked at passenger forecast and the income and expenditure profile for the airport reopening, and thereafter the 25 years of its business plan as part of the overview and scrutiny review back in November. Feels like a long time ago, I don't know about you, but So yeah, that was the risks and the sensitivities were considered as part of that information that was presented at that point in time. So we've got a stable, we've got a position that sort of sets out what the financial plan for the reopening and the next 25 years, and that report also set out the governance arrangement around how the information will be reported in. So if you remember, it would come into Cabinet on a quarterly basis through to Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee. Sorry, I've missed a step out there. FDL Board first, FDL Board, Cabinet, Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee. That will be part of the loan and an expectation in terms of reporting. There may be other expectations, but that's the route that was set out there. And it's also worth just remembering that from a borrowing profile, that didn't kick in till 27-28. So in terms of what you've got in front of you, the framework's there, the actual detail doesn't start from a borrowing point of view, don't kick in till next year.
In light of, the Simca wanting to renegotiate the lease and then putting a pause on the gain share funding being released down to us, how has that affected the plans that you're going forward, and how is the airport being funded daily at the moment until that gain share funding is released, please? So
starting with the day-to-day, we got what was called development funding. So in order to get the project up and running, Simca, so over three meetings, they approved different tranches of funding, and we've still got that. What was your second part? I've got the day-to-day. That's the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Here and now, we've got the development funding.
And the delay in the gain share, how's that going to affect the...
delay. Right, cool. Because what's been said in the press isn't entirely accurate. Simca haven't put... They set out in their decision on the 9th of September. September. They set out there was precedent conditions, and they talked about the range of activities in relation to the project management. They also talked about the lease, and there were also a precedent condition around the investment zone. We're progressing through those matters. If you go back to the decisions that got taken by Cabinet in November, we're progressing on that basis. It just takes time to get through those. So I know the word pause has been bandied around. I don't know if it's in the press or not, but that's not the case. Things are still progressing.
Yeah, and then the other thing is just regarding the
several savings for 26-27 rely upon transformation programmes or activities still described at high level. What assurance can you provide that these savings are both deliverable and measurable? Will you commit to a quarterly public dashboard to allow OSMC to monitor progress, like milestones, RAG ratings, accountable officers, please?
Thank you. I had to go back through the list of savings actually to look at which ones you might be considering transformational. I think we talked last time about there's savings in there, but actually the more challenging is managing and mitigating the pressures that are in there. And we kind of had that overall discussion around the pressures is where a lot of the risk sits rather than delivering the savings, because we do have a good track record of delivering savings. We've delivered 6.4 million of savings against we're projecting to deliver 6.4 against 7.3 for 25-26. And external audit have kind of said we've got a good track record. I was thinking back to the conversation. I think one of the areas that there is transformation is children's, and we've talked about the additional investment in children's, in that preventative, and that there is assumptions moving forward in terms of savings. So that might be an area, well, I think that will be an area where you'll be considering as part of children's scrutiny as well, won't you? In terms of monitoring that and progress and that change really, because that's a significant change as Rebecca outlined last time. In terms of, I think I mentioned the riskiest saving that's in there is in relation to public culture and commercialisation. Pointing because Phil was sat there. In terms of, but we have mitigated that by, spreading it over the 3 years rather than 900 and odd K in the first year. But that is going to be a challenge really in terms of delivering that saving. So that's an area we will be, continuing to monitor closely. In terms of the dashboard or, the provided information on the savings, we include the savings tracker in the quarterly finance and performance monitoring report. So we have the summary where it says by directorate, what the target was, what's been delivered in the way, approved, what might be delivered in a different way, or what's been met by one-off, and what's the, unmet for 25-26. And then we have the detail line by line in terms of what was approved and what that position is for those that haven't been delivered as intended. So to try and focus the attention really in terms of on the ones not delivered rather than the ones delivered, they've been delivered as they've been intended and not further reported on. And that was an approach that our external auditors suggested as well, so we brought that into the reporting. In terms of, we can have a look at that and our drag ratings, or we can add further information in terms of the milestones as well for 26, 27. So we can have a look at how we can kind of, I suppose, increase the information provided as part of that quarterly information.
Thank you. Next one, Councillor Jackson, please.
Excuse me. Given repeated references to the ageing condition of the council's estate, can you provide OSMC with a complete schedule of deferred maintenance and backlog liabilities and explain how the capital programme prioritises these essential works against new capital commitments in the 2026-27?
I'll take this. First off, I think it'd be worth knowing that there's condition surveys undertaken on all our assets, and we have a asset register that provides all that information. The teams undertake statutory and planned maintenance, and the building managers know the buildings well. So whilst it's quantified at a particular point in time, it's an ongoing process because buildings get older, parts of the buildings fail, so that information is updated on a regular basis. We can obviously come back with the more detail in terms of what the overall value is, but it's set within that context that the capital programme is being built up with from a perspective of we haven't got an awful lot of money. So you'll notice within the capital programme there's quite a long list of fairly minor items like windows and boilers and stuff like that, because that's come from the professional building management team knowledge about what assets we have and what's about to fail. So we haven't the money particularly to do cyclical maintenance, so we are just doing it on a needs must basis at this stage. I did think now lots of ward members will know by going into the assets that our estate is in poor condition, and we are getting to a point where that's part of the asset rationalisation programme. We're considering whether we continue to invest in those assets or whether we're looking, that's why the asset rationalisation programme's there, to see whether we can invest in one and dispose of another. So it's looking at things in different ways, not just a figure, because that will be a big scary figure in terms of the backlog of maintenance.
When you say it's in a poor state, the asset register, how come it's got to that stage where you class it as a poor state?
Mainly because we haven't had the monies to invest in it over longer than decades. We have to. I think it sets it out in the report that we have to look from a health and safety point of view, and I didn't get round to it last meeting talk about car, flex and tail. So we're categorising all our assets by what's intrinsically required in order to deliver car statutory services like children's services and adults. And then which is the flex, which is the middle ground. And I would probably put community libraries in that category for example. And then there's some tail, which is things that we've inherited, which we've, that have been developed over a number of years, which are sort of nice to have, but not really something we can afford to continue maintaining. So we do look through those lenses of that car, flex and tail as well as part of that, determining where the resources go.
If at the end of the MTFS, this period, things favourable for us as a local authority, looking forward, would the asset register be something you'd return to? Is that anything of a priority to try and make it healthier? Should things become more favourable regarding service pressures and things like that?
So, interesting perspective, because this year you'll probably notice that the capital programme is typically about £100 million a year. And this year it's something like 250. So the proposals which are in front of you are there's significant investment in relation to roads. Sorry, I should caveat that I'm speaking about buildings when I'm talking about this, but backlog and maintenance could equally be, in terms of our infrastructure, so traffic lights and the road infrastructure. But from an asset point of view, that list, so we are investing in things like the Mansion House and the archives, car assets, which are, the Mansion Houses, for example, Grade 2 listed building. There's no way we can't not invest in it when there's some of the issues that have been identified. And so we do look through the lens in the first instance because of the challenging financial environment to reduce that as much as possible. But we've equally, when we have got a little bit more money and we have through this settlement, not as much as we need, but better than we have had previously. So we've taken the opportunity to make that investment. It's still not going to be sufficient for, as I say, all the parks that we have, the leisure estate that we have, etc., etc. That's the worrying, that we've got lots of assets that we've had for a very long time and they need more money spending on them.
Yeah, thank you for that. Councillor Hollingworth, next question, please.
Oh, excuse me. What assurance can you provide that the demand assumptions used for adults and children's social care, including placements, fee inflation, workforce costs, are realistic and evidence-based? How have worst case and best case been modelled, and what is the financial sensitivity range?
Thank you, Councillor Hollingworth. I think we've explained in terms of working closely with the managers, so we work really closely in terms of what the assumptions are. Particularly, I think when you're talking about adults and children, you're talking about those placements, you're talking about kind of residential for adults, residential home care, supported living, for children's various placements in terms of out of authority, fostering, kinship. So we work through all the details. So what's the current numbers at the point in time when we start having the budget discussions? What's the projections to the year end? What's the projections for the future years? And we're working through each line, each area of spend, kind of look at, right, so this is current. What do we think is going to happen over the rest of this year, but also thinking into next year, the year after. And it starts to become more kind of the further you go, the less kind of, I suppose, more detailed it is really in terms of the focus is on this year and next year and what that's looking like, and then just project it out. For adults, we do look at the population information. We look at, we've also built into the assumptions what the impact or what the estimated impact is of transitions moving from children's into adults, and we've done that this year, going through each placement, actually, each child placement, and then thinking about, well, based on previous, what's kind of, you know, materialised to build in some assumptions. They are still assumptions. We can't say now what, you know, what's going to happen with that child and how, you know, where they're going to need to be really in terms of when they're receiving adult services. But we've looked at each line, working with the managers and estimating what that impact is. I think Debbie referred to the Appendix B, where we've tried to put in more information in terms of what those assumptions are, how many people they're supporting, and I've added a bit more information in my Section 151 assessment as well in terms of overall the numbers of working age adults, for example, overall the number of older people that we're supporting. I think Rebecca talked last time as well about we've looked at short breaks and more people are having to access short breaks. We've built in extra funding for those and how much that equates to. So we've literally been through every line and kind of worked with managers to forecast what the impact is. Fee inflation, we know what the current contracts are, so we've looked at what the future inflation rates are expected to be, and we've built those into the inflation estimates. With adults, we went through a really, really detailed cost of care modelling. So we have that modelling in terms of the breakdown of that cost of care and then apply. So for staffing, national living wage, and again, you know, for others, we've kind of used the future inflation forecasts. So it's a detailed basis and detailed breakdown. We don't necessarily do worst case and best case because if you look at all the different assumptions, you could add 10% on here, or you could add 20% on here, or you could add, you know, you could kind of model. We've got this, I talk about spreadsheets quite a bit, don't I? But we've got the spreadsheet set up so you can model different assumptions and what that would be on the estimates. But because you could model various scenarios, we kind of focus on what's the estimated, and then we kind of almost overall kind of then look at, so take a step back and what contingency do we need to set aside, because as we've talked about that balance, if we set aside contingency, then it's not money, you know, to be spent on services. So you need to strike that right balance. What we don't want to do is kind of set aside a big contingency, because obviously we're finance, we like to be as prudent as possible, but then we're kind of, you know, restricting what services are delivered and things like that. So you've got to kind of get that balance right, which is what we try and do working with the managers. Yeah, I think, just saying if there's anything else. Oh, yeah, that was the other point I was just going to make. In terms of children's social care, we talked about the out-of-authority placement. We talked about how much each out-of-authority placement is, and that 3 out-of-authority placements could impact by about $1 million. So when you're looking at those kind of figures, whereas other lines, it's a lower impact. So depending which you do your sensitivity on, obviously depends on what the outcome is. So when you know, some of these are really significant amounts, like I say, so different sensitivities kind of a big impact.
Next question, Councillor Jackson. I'll take it if you want. No, it's all right. Can you provide OSMC with a breakdown of the affordability assessment undertaken for the £248.2 million capital programme for 26-27, including revenue implications, borrowing headroom and the effect on long-term liabilities? How is affordability monitored in year, especially in the context of Treasury risks? Please.
Okay, I suppose first of all it's worth just highlighting that the 248 is funded a mix of some grants, some borrowing, and the Appendix 1 details of the 248, the split of the funding. You've also got in there significant funding for housing as well, really, in terms of, you know, the housing funding, the HRA. In terms of the revenue implications of the capital, I think I talked last time about the CAP 1 process, where we ask each manager to fill in a CAP 1 form, which is a bit of a business case really in terms of why they need the capital, what it's funding, health and safety, priorities, captures a lot of information. One of those information streams is about revenue implications as well. So the expectation is that if there is a new capital investment and it would have ongoing revenue implications, that's flagged as part of that CAP 1 and then features in that revenue budget. One example that we have got is the Conisbrough Depot, where there's a capital investment but there's also revenue implications, and we've incorporated an assessment. I think where it's funded from borrowing, they do calculation in terms of what's the estimated minimum revenue provision based on for each capital investment. So every capital investment will have a different asset life, so it'll be based on that specific asset. So for example, fleet, lower asset life, so the minimum revenue provision will be calculated based on that asset life. Buildings, we've talked about longer asset life, so different profile for minimum revenue provision. So that's the MRP, short for minimum revenue provision, and how that's calculated, and then that's built into the revenue budget as a requirement. In terms of borrowing, we factor we feed the borrowing costs into our treasury management strategy statement. So that's then picked up as part of that treasury management statement, looking at what we've talked about in terms of managing that cash flow, looking at under borrowing and those estimates of capital spend. So that feeds into that, and then that sets what the revenue budgets need to be from a treasury perspective. We've talked quite a bit about how that treasury risk is managed and how we mitigate it and that close monitoring. So I suppose I don't really think I'd say anything more on that really, in terms of just that's how it all kind of links in terms of those calculations, that background, and how it feeds into the budget reports.
No, thank you for the explanation. This is the final question from OSMC. Across the entire budget, there are intersecting risks, obviously. DSG, Treasury refinancing, airport funding, social care volatility and pressures on reserves. Can you explain how corporate resources integrates these into a single consolidated risk model? And will you commit to sharing the consolidated model with OSMC prior to full council? Please.
Thank you, Chair. This is a really good question, and it's coming back to, I think, what Debbie said about it being complicated, complex council, and I think we've talked about last time about it's an art, not a science. It's not, we don't have a logarithm or something, that feeds all these risks in and kind of says, yeah, you need to take 10% of that, you need to take 20% of that, you need to take this or that. We rely on that wealth of, all those discussions that we've had with managers. We rely on, all those considerations in terms of what the proposals are. My experience as a Section 151 and, the management's experience really in kind of assessing, based on all the things we know, what kind of risk, what kind of level of reserves do we need, what kind of level of contingency do we need, and it's trying to strike that balance all the time, and it's that close monitoring and that close review that we just need to ensure we do. So, not so much a consolidated risk model per se, but we take into account all those risks when we're identifying and coming to those conclusions in terms of what we need.
Sorry, I forgot to say, Michael. I know what you mean about when you're saying you're pulling everything in. Is there anything on the horizon regarding, for example, software that can help you to become more streamlined that way, rather than like calling people into meetings and getting the information over them physically and then bobbing it into a database which builds it all up? Is there anything on that can make it more consolidated over the coming years? Do you know, is that anything that you're looking at, whether that's a thing or not?
I'd say there's probably a risk of doing that. Because of the complexity of what we're talking about, when you understand the level of what service lines and heads of service that we have in the council and the different services that they have as responsibility, understanding what drives that and the volatility that impacts on those services, it's only through the synthesis of all of that information that would arrive at, because it, as I described right at the beginning of the meeting, the complexity of understanding service delivery and the investment that's required in terms of the capital programme. The programme impacts on, depending on your risk around your perspective around from a treasury management point of view, has an interrelation back to the financing. And it's what the revenue report does, that Appendix A, that brings together all those expenditure risks, all the income risks, but it's that in itself is complicated, but it's a gross oversimplification of what's behind that in terms of the detail. And I guess you'll get to, and the overview scrutiny committees will get to know more about that as they start to have conversations with each of the different departments of within the council, and then and some are more stable than others. And your point around could modelling be applied on those, but there would be a massive risk if you did the simple computer says on adults and children, because one child can skew the forecast massively, and you'll see that as you start getting as you start receiving the monitoring information. So we were having a conversation about Q3 this morning, and without spoiler alert, there's a deterioration in a particular budget for people, and it's made such a massive difference. So, you know, it's really is having those conversations with the service managers that are dealing with the decisions in relation to those service areas it's a quantification of those activities that yields the budget, not an algorithm.
I think the final phase is when I talk about the question, the full budget, when you pull them together to form the full budget, how technical is that? Is it can it be more streamlined, or are you about as efficient as you can be at the moment with what's available to you for pulling all that together? Because it sounds like a hell of a job.
Yeah, I suppose you can't say you can never be more efficient. We're always looking to be more efficient and effective. We have talked about, I am really grateful in terms of the team. We have lots of experience in our team. We really rely on our finance capital managers, been working with the capital for a long time, our financial planners that work in the team, they've done this a number of years, and they have well-tried, well-tested, ways of calculating it. We looked, I talked about our MTFS spreadsheet before, didn't I, really, in terms of how that's set up. We are going to review that, see if we can simplify it to try and help and kind of, help probably in terms of just simplify that information and how we calculate it. But we do have tried and tested ways. One of the key things is talking to each other, making sure everyone understands each assumption. That one's really, really key, making sure that we're feeding those capital estimates into the revenue, and we're doing those kind of, with those those areas that cross-cut, because that's where you find sometimes there's a potential where there's a misunderstanding. We've talked a lot about all the grants that have kind of, been merged into the revenue support grant, or the, just in terms of that children and families and youth grant, just the grants going into there and making sure that, we're not double counting, or that, because when you've got 2 million grant going into an overall, these are big figures that you need to make sure that, we're aligned, and that one, because we have different, I think, was it Phil last week that talked about the business partnering role and how we have different business partnering supporting each directorate. So we need to get them together to then build that information in collectively as well. So we do have lots of, working documents that we share and we kind of collate, but it is about that, making sure in terms of having those conversations in terms of what are the assumptions, and that is key. And like I said, the wealth of the experience of the finance team is just thank you to them as well.
I will make a point that actually from the data settlement to actually producing the paperwork, you can probably see the amount of stuff that's got to be got through in such a short amount of time. It's phenomenal. There is a risk, and I've said this to Faye, that we're relying on a few people that actually are intrinsic. As Faye's describing, we are very fortunate. We've got people who've worked here a long time and are experienced, and therefore when they understand the way around, and they also know who they need to go to in order to get the right information, and they actually have a relationship with those individuals that means that there are barriers to the flow of information. If that started to crumble, there will be weaknesses because we are there's one particular individual who's got an important job to do in terms of closure of accounts, budget and revenue monitoring. And that presents a risk for me in terms of the organisation. But it also means, whilst he's here, that we have the benefit of all of that you know, one dimension, one perspective sort of thing. So, yeah, it's really complicated, and it needs to be done on spot, on point, and really quickly.
Thank you for that. That concludes the these questions, unless anybody's got anything they'd like to ask from all that. Not at all. Is anybody from any of the elected members would like to ask a question? Councillor Wood.
It's about revenue. There's some boxes on there. It's price on application. How do you determine what that's going to cost and what you're going to actually raise out of it?
So are you fees and charges?
Yeah.
So generally fees and charges, we have budgets set. So we look at all the current fees and charges. We look at what the current budget is. We look at where they are projected to change, how much that might deliver. I think Debbie talked about previously, when we're looking at overall income from fees and charges increases, it's not material in terms of the overall, but we should be, trying to obtain as much fees and charges as we can. So what we do is we work with the budget holder in terms of what the impact of the proposals is on the budget, and then those should be factored in. If it's a specific one, I can have a look, see which ones are always.
Yeah, so some we don't disclose at this point because they're commercially sensitive.
I'm talking about, it's, like somebody rents town centre out with children's rides. It's on here, it comes in as Events Doncaster. So Events Doncaster, they've got charities and they've got commercial, but against them both it says like fees, price on application. But from a transparency point of view, how does different people know that they're getting a good deal from Doncaster and they're not actually being unfairly treated to other people?
That's a judgment call, into, I guess, in terms of whether people feel that when they, as I say, some of these that we've withheld because they're commercially sensitive, and because we're being undercut by other people. So I guess it would come back to when you approach a company around wanting a particular service, it's your judgment call as to whether you think you're getting good value or not.
And then one other thing was the North Bridge, the MOT centre. We've not increased prices on MOTs for 3 years, because they're tied into whatever we've got, like benchmarks from everything else. But the taxi MOTs, which drivers can only go to the North Bridge to get the cars MOT'd, do actually generate the percentage increase year on year of what we actually set it. Would it not be better for us to be concentrating on that before we go to Joe Public for a fixed fee?
And I think, so first and foremost, the depot's there to provide services for council, because we've got a big fleet, I think about 700 vehicles. So that's predominantly what it's there for. And then, as you say, taxis next and then public. I think that I don't suspect there's an awful lot of people that actually use it from a public, but if people, I know that there's an old, because I've got an old car, people with vintage cars, 1972 Beetle if you're interested, people with vintage cars would go there because it's been looked at by people with, you know, they've got that type of experience. So, yeah, I don't think it's not a money generator. As I say, top order, we have it because we need it. Second order, taxis. Third order,
It's just
public.
something that would be interesting to see actually the
The
split to make
proportion.
sure that it
We
is.
can ask that
Yeah,
question
that'd be
in
great.
terms of
Thank
income.
Thank you. Anyone else? No. What we'll do then is we'll move on to some recommendations. The committee confirms that it has considered the Mayor's draft budget proposals and has agreed its scrutiny, observations and response for submission to the Mayor and Cabinet. The committee confirms that its scrutiny has been undertaken in line with the key focus areas, including alignment with priorities, evidence-based, deliverability and risk. The committee confirms that its review has been undertaken in line with the recognised scrutiny best practice and has maintained a strategic focus and constructive challenge. And also the committee notes that scrutiny has taken place prior to publication of the final government settlement and that final funding assumptions remain subject to confirmation. I'll propose all those recommendations. Will anyone second it? Thank you, Councillor Jackson. Does the committee agree with that? Thank you for that. I'll now move on to the committee's decision. Can I have a proposer to move that the chair be authorised to agree and issue the response letter to the Mayor and Cabinet on behalf of the committee, please? Would someone propose that for me? Thank you, Maria. And is that seconded by anyone? Again, thank you, Councillor Jackson. Are there any other recommendations that the committee would like to make at this time? Okay. Regarding the letter, that will provide feedback on the committee's consideration of the Mayor's budget proposals. Key points from Thursday's meeting have already been circulated to the committee earlier today, and I will add the following areas from this day's discussion, and Caroline's going to assist me with that.
Sorry. So from some of the questions today, you've asked around council tax scenario modelling, savings impact, adequacy and stress testing of general fund reserves, DSG override scenarios and general fund implications, refinancing risk, stress testing under borrowing exposure, airport funding risks and sensitivity analysis, deliverability of transformation-linked savings, condition of council estate and backlog of maintenance, validity of social care demand and cost assumptions, affordability assessment of 26-27 capital programme, and integration of budget risks into consolidated model. So I can do some bullet points around that for the letter, Chair. Is that right?
Thank you, Caroline. That'd be great. The committee has now completed its scrutiny of both the draft corporate plan and the Mayor's draft budget proposals and agreed its observations and response for submission in accordance with its role within the Council's budget and policy framework. So if you would like to take this opportunity to leave, because we've just got one more item to consider, but that's for the committee. Is that all right? We'll crack on, yeah. Yeah, we'll crack on. Item 5, which is item 8 from Thursday's agenda, overview and scrutiny work plan and the council forward plan of key decisions. Caroline will now provide us with some updates.
So I'm just going to update on what's coming up over the next few months. Well, this week it's health and adult social care. They're going to look at public health protection report. Next week at CNE, it's feedback on consultation around waste collection. And then then after that, it's scrutiny of the Safer Doncaster Partnership. So it's community environment's role as a crime and disorder committee. Then in March, there's the quarterly finance reports. Children's in March, looking at sufficiency and placements for children and 16 plus. And regeneration and housing, which will include Living Up Round 3 and major schemes for Waterfront Waterdale. So some of the things coming up Chair, do you want me to go into the forward plan? Please. So I'll just raise from the forward plan, it's mostly, as you can imagine, budget. So all the budgets, decisions and corporate plan decisions, and then it'll be the quarterly report that's coming up in March.
Yeah, we've already scheduled in a meeting early April to meet and discuss a framework, OSMC framework for all the panels. And it will include the budget as we carry on throughout the year, but also things like items on the risk register, the MTFS in particular. And it'll give also chairs of those panels the chance to deep dive any such discussions that have come to place today, such as DSG. That's one of the examples given. So we'll all get the opportunity, and hopefully we'll pad the work plan out a little bit more than it is at the moment. But we'll look forward to those meetings. And for now, we can close the meeting and Caroline can stop the recording. Yes, Jane?
I did put forward some suggestions for the forward plan. Have you got those, Karen? Yeah.
Yeah, at the minute, as you might be familiar with, it's at this kind of point we start gathering information, and then it'll be more towards May and then we'll have the work planning meetings which formulate the actual work plan. So yeah, we have noted them. Thanks.